Hello and welcome to the Azure Cloud Chronicles. Now we're on networking. This is going to be part 7 of our series on networking. We're going to talk about Azure network security. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm Principal Cloud Architect at 3Cloud. I'd like to introduce my colleague, John Morehouse.
I'm John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant with D'Antoni and Associates, and I love security, even in
We've
Azure.
talked a lot about network security
Yes.
throughout this talk because it's really hard to talk about networking without talking about without security. In this podcast video, we're going to bring together, I think, a lot of the concepts that we've talked about, and kind of talk about them in more of an applied fashion. So we're going to talk about things like VPNs, firewalls, DDoS protection, network security groups, some bad habits we have that we do in a lot of our demo environments, and how you shouldn't do that in anything that's remotely close to production. And so
Sure.
grab a cup of, something strong, like coffee or something else. We're recording this at near the end of a pretty long week for me. Uh,
Same.
and so, yeah, bourbon can also apply, or
Yeah,
bourbon can go in
yeah.
your coffee too,
Bourbon.
doesn't it?
Yeah, it's delicious in coffee.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about locking things some down. So we're going to dive into some Azure security features around networking and good security. And I know it's funny. We were talking to, I don't know if you were there. I think I was with Denny at MVP Summit, and we were talking to Bob. And Microsoft doesn't allow employees to deploy Azure VMs with public IP addresses anymore.
Hmm.
And Bob doesn't have a VPN, and I can't remember why. But he was telling me about some reason he had deployed a VM with a public IP. It was to test something that required some kind of outside access or something, and he had figured out the exact time between creating that VM, running his demo, and destroying it, and that so the security tools found it and sent him a nasty email.
I'd believe it.
Yeah.
I would totally believe it. And
So we'll talk about web application firewalls, walk through some NSG stuff, and talk about how to protect your hybrid setup. So let's get into it.
so before we start, how? And so I have a question for you. And we're DBAs, right? We come from the DBA world, and we've kind of morphed into this more architecture solutions type person. How important do you think this is for DBAs to learn?
Whew, that's a complicated question. One of the things I've always found about cloud, and Azure is 15 now, so we're not new at this, but
True.
in the early days of cloud, because of having to configure things like availability groups, which especially back then, required a fairly complex understanding of how Azure networking worked. I think DBAs had a good chance to be the leaders of networking in cloud networking in their organization, because you would end up,
Yeah.
you are kind of first movers in the cloud, and you're the first movers of doing things that are advanced. I still think that's the case to an extent, but what I found that's changed probably as cloud has matured, there's more third-party networking stuff available in the cloud now. So a lot of times when I go into a larger customer, I see things like Cisco's and 40 gigs
Hmm.
and third-party
Recruiters.
network stuff.
Yep.
And as somebody, a lot of times you might have visibility into the core Azure networking, but as soon as stuff goes into those third-party solutions, it is kind of an opaque firewall unless you can
Yeah.
even if you have global admin in Azure, which as a DBA you probably don't, global admin and subscription owner, you don't always have visibility into it. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. But I think understanding how the fundamentals work is really important.
I agree.
It'll prevent you
Yep.
from doing dumb things. And a lot of times you may want to
That
talk,
right there.
and this is going to depend on the size of your org, but you may want to talk people out of trying to use those third-party things because they make things harder, almost invariably. It's a trade-off that your team has a lot of experience with. Pick your favorite network vendor, but it's never the easier way to do things. Sometimes it's better, and we're going to talk about some places today where Azure solutions might not be the best.
I agree with you. And I also think that not using that third party, but I also think it's wise to ask a colleague to double check you. Like today, I talked
Mhm.
to you today about, and I think we're going to talk about it with one of my clients. I have this network solution problem. Excuse me. I have a network problem in Azure, and
Mhm.
I picked your brain about it. Say, hey, this is what I think. Am I right or wrong? Right. And so I bounced that off of you to get a baseboard, a
Yeah,
baseline of
and there are a lot
where
of
that was
things
right.
that are only kind of insecure.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's or like have a low risk tolerance, and that's risk management's always a key part of this. We're going to talk about today because I'm testing a storage thing today, and I built a new VM and I just threw a public IP on it. I didn't bother to restrict the firewall to my IP because I don't even have any data on it. I'm just using disk speed. Yes, could somebody breach it? For sure, but it's not connected to anything else and like no data. So we'll talk about, you don't want to do that stuff in your organization though, because you don't even want to you don't want your company to have a VM breached, even if it was just you testing something. Because especially if you're in a larger company that's publicly traded, you have to report all that stuff.
Yep.
So let's talk about some of our tools. Azure offers some built-in tools that we can use. The first one being, and we were just talking about those open VPNs, and I think, John, maybe you can tell a little bit more about your scenario, but network security groups. This is kind of I think this was the OG of firewalls in Azure. Like this was the first thing we had, and they have stuck around. They're kind of a fairly manual process, but
they're fairly, and they're relatively robust, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But they're typically my last line of defense. Like I'd much rather see a firewall in there, or something else. I don't know. Do you want me to talk about my situation?
Yeah. Let's talk about it because it's a good example.
Yeah, and you and I were chatting on the side earlier in the day about this. I have a client. They have currently they have a production virtual machine running. It is running SQL. And they have a need to, and they have a time crunch, as most production things come about. They have a time crunch, and they need to open up a specific port to that virtual machine for an outside source, public IP traffic, to get access to that virtual machine. And so the client came to me and said, "Hey, how can we do this in short notice?" And we always want to keep it as secure as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they don't. If I add a firewall, then that's an additional cost for them. Or if I add another, a load balancer or something else in place, third party, if I put a Cisco appliance in there or a Barracuda appliance, that's going to be who knows what kind of cost. And there's a time frame there. I can't just drop in a Barracuda and make it all work and not bother their production environment. So I'm going to have to use a network security group, which allows me to allow access to a subnet or a NIC. And I can limit that to a specific public IP. So only traffic from a particular IP or IP range would be allowed access to what I specify.
And frankly, and this is what I was kind of sharing with you, like using a firewall or using something other than an NSG, like a load balancer. I like the load balancer idea just because you don't have to stick a public IP on the VM.
I agree.
But realistically, those solutions aren't adding any value other than giving us a little bit more comfort. They're all doing the same thing.
You're at least obfuscating the public IP away from the VM, right?
Yeah.
That load balancer, to me, it's like a layering thing, right? I want as many layers as possible between the public internet and my production VMs.
But it's kind of one of those interesting things because in this video we're talking about kind of the fine grained nuance of network security and stuff, but to me, what your absolute problem isn't really a network security problem. Like your customer shouldn't, and it's easy to tell your customer this, you shouldn't allow unfettered traffic to 1433. You should build an API that like can hit the tables that are needed or replicate the data somewhere. Anything but allowing direct access to a SQL server.
And I would agree. The client knows that this is not the best case scenario, but they're under directives from higher ups to make this happen,
absolutely
right?
Understand that.
And I get that too.
And
as long as I'm more comfortable with a network security group and we limit it to a specific IP range, like we do that for demos, right? Your demo machine, you could limit that to only your home public IP, and that's relatively secure. Nothing else can get through. We just want to make sure that we configure that correctly. Of course, we don't want to make mistakes, but.
The other kind of nice thing about an NSG too is that you can configure it at the individual. It can be configured at the subnet layer, but it can also be configured at the individual NIC layer. So you can specify that only this particular NIC can be talked to,
and you can specify individual ports, right? So I could say specifically 1433, which is SQL, or 3389, which is RDP. or DNS, which is 25, right? So there's certain things that I could.
DNS is 53, by the way.
53. What's 25? Telnet. Telnet's 53.
Telnet.
What the hell's no SMTP? Sorry.
Yeah. SMTP is 25.
I'm sorry. 53 is DNS, right? I'm sorry.
And 22 is SSH.
We are nerds.
23 is SFTP. Wow. And we're ready for AZ700.
Yes, we are.
I don't think they asked. They might ask. There might be some random port questions on it. It's been forever since I took that exam. Interestingly, though, one of the big differences between NSGs and our next topic, Azure Firewall, there are a whole lot of differences, including about $1,000 a month at minimum.
That's the other problem.
But NSGs only work with IP addresses. You can't use domain names.
Yep.
I think you can use service tags, maybe. We'll take a look in a second. But Azure Firewall and third-party firewalls, they all mainly work the same. They're stateful, provide layer 3 through 7 protection. You can use fully qualified domain names, DNS filtering, and there's some threat intelligence.
And that I think having a firewall in place instead of an NSG is a more robust solution, right? But you hit the nail on the head about the additional $1,000 a month cost that my client really doesn't want to incur at this point in time.
And at the end of this video, I'll link to the video we did on Azure Firewall where we kind of walk through that. It's really powerful. It's a lot harder.
It is.
It's a lot harder to set up because there's a lot of rules in place that you have to do. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're working on your own personal stuff and you just maybe want to limit some things. NSGs can be a better solution. As soon as you get to any level of scale, it's generally worth it to have a firewall in place. But for like small personal things, NSGs are plenty secure. Next, let's talk about web application firewalls. These, I think a lot of times we get these confused with real firewalls, and they're just serving two different purposes. I guess it's almost like I'm trying to think of another comparison. It's like a storage appliance. It's like a really fast SAN versus a backup appliance. That would maybe be my comparison. The web application firewalls have a real specific set of rules around web apps. I know the ones in Azure that you would typically use are Front Door and an application gateway. Those have some protection around SQL injection and some other variability around web stuff. Anything else you want to add there, John?
A WAF, web application firewall, that's what you'll hear it called as a WAF, is basically the bouncer. It's going to keep all the traffic away from the door.
The other thing you'll have there too is some of them will do SSL termination. So what that means is when you're coming in on an HTTPS connection, instead of having to decrypt that certificate on the actual web server itself, it'll decrypt it on the gateway. And that may sound trivial, but if you're running a really busy website, taking that CPU load off the web server can be pretty helpful.
Yep.
Finally, we're gonna talk through kind of a big service, a big service in terms of cost. And this is one of those ones where I mentioned earlier, you maybe don't always want to use the native Azure solution. And that's DDoS. And DDoS is distributed denial of service attack protection. So if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically when you have a botnet that has a bunch of infected computers and it just tries to send pings and various requests to an IP address to murder your website. This was something that was really hard to defend against before the cloud. Didn't you just implement this with a client, John?
We did. We implemented DDoS for a client. They've got a couple web apps behind an application firewall, web application firewall. So they're using the firewall to help control security. And then we put a DDoS plan on it. The DDoS plan was about $3,000 per subnet. Per VNet. And that covered all of them, but what we did find is the DDoS program was actually cheaper. You can do it on the VNet level, or you can do individual public IP addresses.
Okay, cool.
And they had a relatively small deployment, and so they only had a handful of public IP addresses. So it's actually cheaper to go to the per IP address protection versus the entire VNet. And they're quite happy with it. It was really easy to switch too. I was kind of impressed.
Yeah, the alternative solution there is really Cloudflare, right? That's the big solution in the space, and they may be a lot cheaper for you.
Yeah, I was just going to say I think they're a little bit cheaper than the DDoS plan.
And a lot of folks will use those in conjunction with with their websites. But yeah, so don't feel bad about mixing there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing we're going to kind of talk about in this session is a little bit around hybrid networks and a couple of different things there, private link and service endpoints, and we'll kind of run through some of this. So, John, let's talk about the bad thing I did.
You opened it up, didn't you?
There's a new feature, by the way, that everyone should know about because I figure most of our audience cares about storage performance. I enabled Performance Plus storage, I think it's called, it works for Premium V1. Very cool. That's why I have such a big VM provisioned here. You'll see 16 gig, 120 or 16 CPUs, 128 gig. Lots of IOPS. I wanted to test Premium V2 versus Premium Plus on V1, and just to mention they're pretty comparable. But I did something bad. John, point out all the bad things I've done.
One, assuming like if we play this as a production box, you got a public IP address.
Correct, because I wanted to just RDP to it.
Yeah. So, but now let's go look at your NSG.
So here we're going to go to the NIC and
Network Security Group.
Network Security Group.
So you have a security group.
You'll see, I have an RDP rule.
So this is number 2. You have an RDP rule, but it's open to everybody. So if anybody finds your public IP, they can try to hit your box on 3389.
So let's fix that because this is pretty easy. So we're going to say source my IP address and allow, and then save. We've just made this imminently more secure.
Absolutely.
By the way, this is the default. If you click next, 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 and create an Azure VM on Windows, it does this. But let's go edit that rule.
Aren't they changing that behavior later this year?
No, they're not. So they might be. I don't know that for a fact. What they're changing later this year, that's a really good point, though. VMs aren't going to have default internet outbound access.
Are they still going? Do you know? Are they still going to get a public IP?
If you give it a public IP, I believe you would have internet access.
So I think because right now, if you created this brand new VM, and by default, unless you say no, it's going to get a public IP.
Correct. Which is what
outbound access.
Yeah, this is just a default Windows VM.
Yeah, and so I think later this year they're no longer doing that. So if you create a brand new VM, you're not going to get a public IP, and you won't get outbound connectivity.
Yeah.
And the recommendation there is to use a NAT gateway.
Yeah, for sure.
To facilitate outbound access for like Windows updates and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so if you're building one-off VMs for a demo, you can just add a public IP. If not, you want to have a NAT gateway.
How many times has that public IP magically shown up because you missed it when you created a VM?
Yeah, for sure.
For now, more times than once.
So there's a couple other ways you can add stuff. You can use, and this is, I know we mentioned you can't use fully qualified domain names. You can create an application security group. There are some services that you can specify. So you see MS SQL here, your various database servers, DNS, LDAP. There's a lot. I think there's more here than there used to be. Or you can specify.
Do you ever use those? I almost always use a port.
I pretty much always use a port. Yeah. I guess there are people who don't know ports like we do, John.
I guess.
So yeah, I can now connect to my VM. These rules on an NSG are going to work just like any other firewall rules. They're processed in order, and denies will block any allows. So if I had a rule that had a priority of 100 that blocked all RDP, I wouldn't be able to get into this VM.
I think it's worth noting that before you changed that, there was a very large warning sign on the rule. If you see that, and if you go explore your environment in Azure and you see that on an NSG, you should really take a note of that and figure out what's wrong. Azure's trying to tell you that something could be drastically wrong, so you need to go fix it.
And
it's gone.
It will get flagged, I think, in Security Center.
Yeah, I'm sure it will.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about is WAF. So I have this little web app. I think we've probably shown it a couple of times. It's called VM Sizes Azure. If you connect to this, it will give you a list of all the VMs that are available in Azure. I don't know if this is actually going to work right away.
That is a really cool app, by the way.
Yeah, it's something I built using Data API Builder in SQL Azure. So one of the things we were talking about that would be a cool demo would be to show to getting an application gateway. So to get a web application firewall, at least on the tiny tier of app service plan I'm on, we can look and see there might be if you change plans, you might have the option to get a WAF. I don't remember. Uh, it doesn't look like it though. It looks like they just cost more. So the way you do this is you front your web app with an app gateway, and I have one here. We built one, just kind of a demo. Hey, and we're following light best practices. Have you ever watched Arrested Development?
No,
There's a joke about light treason.
no.
So here we have web application firewall. We have this policy. We didn't do much. I really built this in the 10 minutes before, but we can see these are going to be the default policies. So it's going to inspect body. There are going to be some managed rules for us. So Microsoft has a bot manager set to protect against malicious bots. If you're not familiar with OWASP, OWASP is like the standard for website protection. And so you can see all these rules that are there as part of web application firewall.
One thing to note here too is I actually had a client come to me this week. They do have application gateways in place for their environment, and they actually got dinged a little bit on a security audit because they did not have rate limiting set up.
Oh, interesting.
So you can set up on your web application firewall, you can actually set up rate limiting to ensure you don't get somebody hammering at your website to try to bring it down.
Yeah, one of the big challenges I read a Cloudflare article about this today, that a lot of organizations are facing is these AI scrapers just hitting their stuff over and over again.
Yeah, and I didn't even think about it, but they reached out and said, "Hey, we need to do this," and I went, "Oh yeah, cool. We can do that with the web app. We can do that with a web application firewall. We can protect you." Which I still have to do.
So let's talk about a couple of advanced features around VMs and connectivity. I'm going to let you talk about your favorite. I'm not going to set it up because it's going to take me a while. I was lazy this morning and just created this with a public IP so I could connect via RDP. Tell me a little bit more about connect via Bastion.
I love Bastion. Bastion, I think, is one of the best things next to sliced bread. And I recommend it in almost every single engagement I come across. And Bastion allows you to effectively RDP into your virtual machines through a browser securely. So you don't need to set up a VPN. You don't need to open up a public IP address to the outside world and control your network security groups. It is a separate thing, so you do have to. If Joey were to go to the connect via Bastion, it would probably ask him to set it up on his VNet.
Yeah.
It's basically a thing for the entire VNet. And what's also cool is that if you have VNets that are peered together, meaning those VNets can talk to each other, that one deployment will allow you to RDP through the browser securely to any virtual machine on either one of those VNets. It does cost a little bit. There is a developer version of Bastion that is significantly cheaper, but you have to deploy it manually.
I thought the developer version was free, but
that might be free.
I could be wrong.
I don't remember, but it's a lot cheaper than like the standard tier.
So the cool thing, and Bastion works on Linux and or
it's
Windows.
It's so cool.
Yeah, so it's SSH on Linux, and I've run into this a few times at SQL Saturdays, where the SQL Saturdays at some community college that has like a tighter network than the NSA does.
Yep.
And you can't,
most schools, yep.
Yeah, and you can't RDP to anything. But you can go out, since Bastion's going to operate over port 443, which is HTTPS, you can connect out and get to your resources. So that's a really handy thing. The next thing I wanted to talk about, and I don't even know where it is, I don't know that I've set it up, is just-in-time VM access.
I know just-in-time. Just-in-time.
Yeah. Maybe it's not here.
Just in time.
Yeah. Justin. Yeah.
I've actually never set that up.
Yeah. Basically, we had this when Denny and I were working at Microsoft. You would automatically, if you needed access to a machine, you would get granted access just to log in at a specific time, and your session would be for so long. Probably a little bit more advanced than most of our customers are dealing with. But if you have really, really tight security requirements, it is something to keep in mind. So let's talk about, before we wrap up, let's talk about hybrid and VPN and all those good things. A little bit of hybrid story. My first hybrid experience was at Past Summit in 2013. I did a demo where I had an availability group that was running on my laptop and in Azure, and it was connected via a point-to-site VPN. And that was one of the hardest things I ever did in technology, was getting that running and keeping it up. Azure was a really different place then. Networking was way more immature and not as good. It's a lot easier now. So, like, John, you were talking about that scenario earlier. Your customer could have potentially given a point-to-site VPN to that customer, right? You want to talk a little bit about that?
They could have. Part of the problem with that is that I don't know what is calling or initiating the traffic. So I don't know if it's a user or a service. I've got some details, but I don't have the whole story yet. And so what we could have done was set up ideally we would have set up a site-to-site VPN, meaning that the entire site that is calling would have access to call into that VM, or a point-to-site, which would be a specific computer or user, would be able to use a VPN, get connected to my client's network in Azure, and then have secured traffic from their origination to my client's virtual machine. That's probably, short of doing firewalls, that's probably the best solution. Most secure solution would be to site-to-site VPN or VPN of some nature, because then I can ensure the traffic is encrypted. Both sides remain secure. Well, my client side would be secure for sure.
Yeah.
I can't speak for the other side, but
yeah, that's something to keep in mind when you have VPNs, especially if third parties, is you really want to do monitoring on those things and keeping an eye on those and look out for changes. The other aspect I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I guess I can share my screen again because I have a SQL database, and this is a good example. Basically all of our Azure tenants that are our personal ones that we demo from are good examples of what not to do in terms of security.
Yes, that's usually true.
So here I want to highlight a couple of things. In this case, I have a public-facing Azure firewall,
Azure SQL database.
Azure SQL database, and I have about 1 million firewall rules, and I should really probably clean up most of these. I'm probably locking myself out. I'll go ahead and add my IP address back, but all of these other ones can go. There was a really interesting security bug this week about somebody that Microsoft has since patched it, but basically if you could touch the firewall rules, you could like destroy all of their Azure environment. That was kind of scary.
That article. You could delete it. You could delete the whole server.
Yeah. The other thing that's in SQL Server here that's really kind of terrible, but there are places where you have to use this with Azure SQL Database, is this allow Azure services and resources to access the server. That button is not allow my Azure services and resources to access the server. It's allow
all of them.
All of Azure. So basically anything running in Azure gets allowed listed for the server. I have automation running against this, and I don't have a whole VNet set up. I could do that. It would consume a lot more resources, which is why I don't. But we have a couple of options for how to secure, and I'm using SQL Database here just because I have one, but this is going to apply to storage accounts. There's a couple other public services that you can create private links for. And we kind of have two options here. I'm not going to go through this, but John and I will talk through them. John, describe private link.
The private link basically takes the resource and puts it onto your VNet that you create. So it has a internal non-public routable IP address. So like if I have a 10 dot whatever address space, my database server would live on that 10 dot address space and get an IP address. And so then all my traffic stays within the confines of my VNet, and I don't route outside of that confines. So
the important thing about that, and why private link is kind of the better way of doing this, is any traffic coming from other networks or VPNs can hit that database. There's another solution that you'll see available called network endpoints. Network endpoints effectively like attach, I can't think of a better way of saying it, a resource to the network, but you don't get an IP. So like when you use a network endpoint, only resources on that VNet can get to that Azure SQL database. But like if I set up a VNet and gave John a VPN, he couldn't get in because the network endpoints aren't going to work over the VNet.
I like private link.
Yeah, I think
Private
we have
endpoint.
another session planned on private link. The hardest part
Cool.
about private link is getting DNS right. Like
Yes. Yeah,
100%.
I 100% agreed.
Private link is
It's
like
always DNS.
it's 10 seconds to set up private link. It's like 3 hours of troubleshooting DNS.
Now, I will say that they've made that experience better, right? They've made the process of creating a private endpoint. DNS is still a little funky, but I totally agree. DNS is the hardest part there.
Yeah, the private endpoint bit's not bad at all. But yeah, so one final thing, if you go hybrid and you're on-prem, and we're talking a lot about cloud security, don't forget to secure the on-prem stuff too. If your
Yes,
on-prem
absolutely.
network is like one flat network, I mean, maybe your cloud network's your DR.
Yeah. Segmentation, people. Network segmentation matters.
Yeah, I know if you're a database pro, it's not really your job, but like if you can connect your SQL servers from your desktop, so can the Russian hackers who are in your
Yep.
network.
Yep. For sure. Network security is important, even for DBAs.
Yeah, so let's wrap up, John. Do you have any comments about some of these features, or
No, as we kind of talked about, and it kind of alludes to the question I asked you. I think all of this is important. At least if you're a DBA and you're starting to work with Azure or even any cloud provider, having some insight into what's available to protect things, and you don't need to know the nitty gritty details. That's what Joey and I do for fun. I still think it's important. At
yeah,
least know what a application gateway is, and where it plays in the role of your environment, especially with your data estate and SQL Server.
yeah, for sure. Those are all things that are really important. Security is not just a feature; it's a mindset, and you want to lock it down early and build trust from your users. One of the things I think the reasons why a lot of organizations got security better in their clouds than they did on-prem was on-prem environments tend to build up, like they tend to like flare out, whereas a lot of cloud environments were built, for migrations, and they could be built with best practices in mind. So like and subscribe. Thank you for tuning
Absolutely.
into the Cloud Chronicles, and we'll be back. We missed we're like a week behind because of MVP Summit and FabCon and stuff, but we'll keep our regular cadence of dropping a video every couple weeks
Yep.
ongoing. So
Yep.
thanks a lot,
Security is
everyone.
everybody's business.
Yeah.
See you later.